We never know what life has in store for us, and the story we'll tell you today is a perfect example of this exciting truth. An Australian man was solidly in his routine. Perhaps his coffee had been the same for 20 years, or perhaps he had always woken up on the same side of bed. Either way, Greg was in for a surprise one day when he took out his dog for a nice morning walk. He had no idea they would walk into an unforgettable, strange pink creature. Now, living in Australia meant that strange animals were somewhat common. After all, most Australians know to shake out their shoes to check for spiders everywhere they go, or be aware of snakes on a casual walk around town. However, this just proves the point further. Greg was so used to strange animals that he didn't think about it when walking his dog. Greg lived along the eastern coast of Australia and routinely walked the same path with his dog, Sparky. Greg and Sparky had been constant companions for years, and this was one of their favorite times of day. Greg loved the quiet mornings. Before and after work, Greg looked forward to getting some outdoor time and exercise on these walks. Similarly, Sparky loved to explore the region with his human, as there is a ton of wildlife and gorgeous scenery on their route. Greg was well accustomed to his sweet dog getting excited and wanting to take detours along the way. So it was of very little surprise when one fateful morning, Sparky caught her scent and began tugging on his leash. Sparky was a few years old and had been trained quite well. All Greg had to do was tug back on the leash and the dog sat and waited, nose stubbornly pointed towards the interesting smell. Sparky would not be distracted from the scent, so after proving to Greg that he would wait for permission, he was let off his leash. Greg had a moment of panic when his dog scampered away towards a nearby cluster of trees. Where was Sparky going so urgently? Would he stop at the trees or just continue running until he reached the ocean? Greg walked towards the circle of trees, eyeing his dog. Sparky ran around the perimeter of the trees several times, then lowered his nose to the ground to sniff each tree individually. When Greg reached the trees, he noticed Sparky displaying particular interest in the trees furthest away. He humored the dog for a few minutes and then called him over to continue their walk. But Sparky did not obey the command. Instead, the dog doubled down, sniffing between some tree roots. This was a very peculiar response. Greg realized he'd have to look into what was occupying Sparky, but there was no way for him to be prepared for what they would find cradled in those tree roots. Sparky grew tentative when Greg came near. He rotated between looking up at his owner and looking down at the tree roots. Greg crouched to see what his dog was so interested in, but saw nothing but dirt and sticks on the ground. What an odd morning, Greg thought, as he clipped the leash back into Sparky's collar. But the day must go on, and Greg needed to get his dog home so he could get himself to work. He gave Sparky a pat on the head and turned to go. Once again, Sparky refused to follow his owner. The pooch planted himself on the ground, and no matter how much Greg commanded him to come and pulled on the leash, he would not yield. What was going on? For a second time, Greg squatted down to examine the tree roots and see what was so interesting to Sparky. This time, he looked more thoughtfully and thoroughly through the dirt. Greg moved some twigs aside, and Sparky barked abruptly. He was close. Using the flashlight on his phone, Greg illuminated the area, and a small pink thumbnail caught his eye. Was this what was bothering Sparky? Greg gently picked up the thumbnail and discovered it was actually alive. The tiny pink creature looked like a miniature rodent cradled in Greg's palm. What the heck was it? After some quick thinking, Greg decided he would turn around and head home. Who knew how long the little fellow would survive by itself there on the Australian coast? As Greg tugged on Sparky's leash to lead him towards home, the sweet dog lowered his snout to Greg's palm, checking on his new friend. After arriving home, Greg laid out a soft blanket for the mystery creature to lay on. He then called into work to say that he would be a few hours late. He had a life to save after all. Then Greg called around to some nearby animal clinics to plan his next steps. Luckily for the little guy, Greg took exactly the right steps to eventually connect with the Australian Zoo Wildlife Hospital in Queensland. The Wildlife Hospital jumped into action, requesting that Greg bring the little fellow into them as soon as he was able. Greg obliged immediately. When they arrived, veterinary technicians were waiting, ready to accept the creature into their care. Professionals at the hospital assured Greg that he'd handled the situation very well. the little creature was examined, and they found him to be relatively healthy despite weighing in at less than a gram. Had it been exposed to the wild for much longer, they said it would almost certainly be dead. Because he was without his mother at such a young age, the hospital warned Greg that there was a chance that he wouldn't make it, despite the fact that he seemed healthy the day he was brought in. Creatures that young needed their mother in a way that humans couldn't replace. Greg understood completely and asked the hospital to keep him up to date. He said goodbye to the little guy and went home to Sparky. A few more weeks went by, and Greg watched out for any progress pictures on the Wildlife Hospital's Facebook page. He was worried for the sweet little fella, even though they hadn't met for a very long time at all. Greg always had a soft spot for animals, wild or tame, and the young animal's age made him worry that the poor little guy wasn't going to make it. However, he eventually learned that everything was going to be all right. The animal was doing very well thanks to the around-the-clock professional care provided at the hospital. The little guy was also growing in popularity on the internet. Each day, more and more people would tune in to witness the miraculous recovery. In this way, Greg's actions had positively impacted people all around the world. But still the question remains, could the creature fully recover? It was a tough question to answer because it wasn't just any run-of-the-mill creature. It wasn't a dog or a cat. And in Australia, it wasn't even a snake or a kangaroo or a spider. In fact, this lovely creature wasn't even dangerous at all. Believe it or not, it was a baby feather-tail glider. The lovely staff at the animal hospital were shocked at first when they realized what it was, but they confirmed this tiny pink creature was in fact the world's smallest marsupial. It can be distinguished by the pouches on their stomachs. Like kangaroos, feather-tail gliders carry their young in these pouches for the first portion of their lives. Anybody could have instantly fallen in love with such an adorable little pink creature. In fact, when his dog Sparky showed his affection by booping him with his snoot, Greg realized the perfect name for the feather-tail glider, Boop. If Sparky had not forced Greg to look under that tree, he would have walked right past Boop and never been the wiser. But thanks to a caring dog and a receptive owner, he saved a life that day. Sadly, Boop would not thrive as a pet, and Greg could not adopt it. Because Boop was born into the wild, it was much better for the animal to live in the wild. Boop wouldn't be happy in a domesticated environment, and Greg understood that when the hospital staff told him. But the hospital has promised that both Greg and Sparky will be in attendance on the day when they can safely release Boop back into his natural territory. Greg also assured Boop's internet following that he would make an effort to visit Boop while on his daily walks with Sparky. We are all thankful to Greg for his kind gesture. What would you do if you saw a strange pink creature just lying in the dirt? We would love to hear your thoughts, so tell us in the comment section below.